major disasters, but the day-to-day operations of DHS are pretty much law enforcement. So there's a big intersection with the law. I'll turn it on over then.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Chelsea Magnet. I'm so thrilled to be here with you, and sorry I couldn't be there in person. I am currently at the Brunswick Group, but started my career in the intelligence community. I was a CIA analyst for almost 10 years, and then went from CIA over to Google to do geopolitical risk analysis. So very familiar with a lot of the concepts we'll be talking about today, but wrapped up my time most recently at Google as a cybersecurity policy person, specifically focused on the intersection between security and emerging technologies. So a lot of thinking about this topic and the security of AI systems. So yeah, really excited to be here. Thanks, you guys.
Very much. And I want to start off with the first round of questions from this panel, basically taking this a second to talk about the background of AI technology. And I have a specific question for you, Chelsea, to start this off. So while AI technology isn't necessarily new, it's definitely come to the forefront of our conversations with ChatGPT and Claude coming out in 2023. And I would like to take a second to ask you about your personal experiences, both at the CIA and with your role at Google, to see how both the private and the public sectors were using AI in terms of threat detection and cybersecurity.
Yeah, thanks, Elise. I really love this question because AI and cybersecurity share a lot of like founding principles. We can thank Alan Turing and his development of algorithms and modern computing because those foundations really like paved the way for cybersecurity as well. So a lot of what we've been seeing in the recent past, I could go back to like the 80s and the 90s, but before this wave of generative AI, a lot of what we saw in this space was automated threat detection, which has been a huge game changer for cyber defenders. And, I'm happy to talk about that in more detail because I think like most people who've been in cybersecurity, we think that generative AI has the ability to even supercharge that further. But AI has really allowed security defenders to kind of find these needle in a haystack threats and really like automate a lot of what was really tedious before, which has been hugely important because the cybersecurity workforce is lacking people, and there's a huge rate of burnout. So that's been huge. A lot of the apps and email servers and all of these things that we use on a day-to-day basis have been using AI for years as well too. Like I think about Gmail quite a bit. With this question, Gmail's been using AI to filter out spam and phishing and all of those like cybersecurity attempts in your inbox for over a decade. I think one other really interesting place that people don't often think about is that AI sort of powers a lot of public and private sector, behind the scenes system administration work. So, as we're thinking about who has access to sensitive information within an organization, AI can kind of help figure out who needs access to specific systems and who doesn't, and really like limit that to limit the potential for insider risk issues and nation state actors getting into systems that they shouldn't be in. So just sort of want to wrap up my comments here with again highlighting this point that like there has been so much good stuff that's happened in this realm with AI, but again, I think there's such an incredible moment here to really like supercharge everything that's been happening and maybe shift what we've seen, even with those advances from defenders really having to always be on the lookout to really giving the advantage to the defenders rather than the offenders. So I'll say at the top, like I've been sort of more of an AI optimist, so take all of my comments with that grain of salt in mind. But yeah, thank you for that.
And also that same question for you, since you have 20 years of experience with the department, and also knowing that DHS is very forward thinking and quickly to adopt this technology as well.
So yeah, so just in a general kind of level setting, there's artificial general intelligence, Skynet, big scary things. AI and machine learning, all that's in my grad school days. But that ML technology has been around for quite a while, and DHS actually has been using it in quite a few things. Primarily, what many may or may not know is ICE is not simply an immigration agency. They have a huge chunk of their mission is called Homeland Security Investigations. They're looking at transnational crime, opioids, combating child sexual exploitation and online abuse, human trafficking. So it's a massive investigative body, and they're one of the earliest adopters of really trying to take an advanced technology and turn that into an investigative tool. So there was very early adoption of the over the last, say, 18, 19 months. Now that we've got quite a few of these tools deployed, just to brag about ourselves a little bit, we've rescued 65 children from in captivity, put 8 people behind bars for life, have hundreds and hundreds of warrants out and leads on cases. So we've taken what used to tell you what to watch next on Netflix, which is a pretty low consequence decision, or if accident tells you to watch the Barbie movie, but you wanted Oppenheimer, no big deal. But you don't want to use this in a situation that's going to really touch people's lives. Another sort of unofficial fact that I think is true is that DHS intersects the lives of the average American person more than any other agency. It definitely intersects your life. It interacts with the most people on the TSA alone. Millions of people a day at the checkpoint. 3 million for the first time this last Thanksgiving. And so they're very interested in how can I expedite people through the checkpoint with knowing all that we know about people. Pre-check is one thing, but how can we do things to know who this person is, why they're traveling, how to route people, what can we do with this information? So DHS has been very forward-leaning and trying to figure out how to automate, because there's always got to be a person. I remember who it was. Somebody brought up Dover earlier. I'm happy to hear that people are thinking about that in this space, because that is an issue that I think will arise in the DHS mission pretty soon. Right now, when you're talking about child exploitation, a person still has to watch the video or look at the picture. And these are traumatic photos people shouldn't have to look at. But someone has to confirm that a crime was committed. And so then what we've done is, instead of that person then having to pore over the photos to look for clues and evidence and create a case, they can see it once, and now the tool takes the role of taking and dissecting the information that we got from the photo. So that's been a huge thing. But what happens when we want to go the next step and let the machine identify that it's a crime? Now I've got a Dover issue, because there isn't a body of literature right now that says a computer can identify a crime that's happened. Also, there's Fourth Amendment issues, seizure. We have a lot to really unpack with that. I often say that the greatest technical challenge that the product is the Fourth Amendment. It should be. I totally agree with that. But there's a lot of things you can do with technology that would violate that. So
I thought it's really interesting. So my previous role was with Meta's oversight board, and when we launched in 2020, definitely were thinking about AI and automation, because so much content moderation is automated. We don't love, it is really emotionally, mentally, as somebody who has looked at a lot of terrible images online as part of that job, it's exhausting and it's really draining. And content moderators do so much work. So how the companies can implement more and more AI is it has a net benefit. However, one of the very first cases and examples that the oversight board looked at was around breast cancer awareness in Brazil. And a woman who had had a mastectomy had shared images of what her breasts looked like after the mastectomy. Meta has an exception for the no nipples, and the amount of time I could spend talking about female nipples is a lot, so I won't bore you with it. But there is an exception to that rule, which says if you're showing a female nipple for the purposes of educating and to show these health problems or consequences or whatever for health awareness, that should be allowed. And one of the things that the board looked at was that while Meta had made this exception, they had never trained their classifiers on how to find health-related information. And so every picture of female nipples was removed until somebody appealed. And so the only way you really could get out that health information was to go directly to the company. And so AI, years and years ago, before we started talking about generative AI, was a crucial part of this content moderation. Detecting CSAM is another thing that all of the tech companies do. Chelsea and I can probably talk ad nauseam about the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who run a database of known child abuse imagery, and then that is automatically removed when uploaded. And so there are really good things that AI can do. And that's before we get to the generative AI layer at that base level.
Yeah, and just to wrap up my thought. There are, in my world, we talk about high consequence, low consequence decisions. If I pull you out of the line at TSA, or I look at your bag, if I actually physically examine your bag as a TSO, low consequence, hopefully you didn't miss your flight, no real big deal. Until I start treating some segment of the population. So even in some of the low consequence decision making, we have to ensure responsible use. And some of you follow the department, the secretary issued an AI task force memo. The EO is very heavily focused on responsible use. We take that to heart, and it's a key piece of everything we do. And so probably throughout the talk, they all talk about avoiding bias and about those decision points that you mentioned. Facebook or Instagram, whatever, removing images. If someone has an image on their phone that's a top only naked child and the machine mistakes that or CSAM and decides to then push them through a prosecution, that's a very high consequence. And so there's a lot I think to be cautious of, but I think the tool, benefits of the tools will outweigh the consequences if we use them properly.
We just spoke a little bit about content moderation, and I want to briefly ask a little bit more about your article, Rachel, about the point you make about passing stakeholder achievements, how that may have a better way to simply choose brought on by generative AI in comparison to government regulation. And actually, be interested in the third base on this, but would you be able to talk more about that?
Absolutely. I was really, the panel that we had around scientific discovery earlier today really also underscores a lot of the points that I think all three of us want to make, in that public and private partnership around technological development it's not new. It's not a thing that we're all just coming up with because the problems seem a lot worse. We actually, I used to work for the Department of Commerce, and so things like the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is this coalition, this group of people, anyone can join, and they make decisions by consensus. They actually stomp their feet and hum if they want to. They all agree with something, and so we've had this public multi-stakeholder consultation around the whole development of the internet, lots and lots of other technologies, whether that's like your NFC and things like that. We do have these groups of people that work on this stuff together, and it's really helpful because, as Adam just mentioned, the government has a lot more power, right? You can prosecute someone for an image of CSAM, whereas Facebook just doesn't want you to see it because their advertisers don't like it, and they will lose money because their advertisers don't want images of children being abused running alongside Nike ads, or Johnson and Johnson or something like that. Like they want to make sure that the advertisers are happy, so their risk assessment is a little bit different than locking someone up or putting someone in jail. And the incentive structure around what the public sector or the government is doing, the private sector is doing, can both be misaligned, which is why you need to include the users, the academics, the experts, the civil society organizations, or looking at things like bias, to come to a good, it might take a while, but it's hopefully going to be a much more resilient, sustainable solution.
I sort of forgot the question.
Sorry.
We're all over the map on that answer, but I'd say a couple of points on to follow on to that. When you look at the various missions that we're trying to accomplish within the department, I keep coming back to the investigative piece, but I think that, the bigger challenges come when it's more directly interfacing with the public. So if I go back to the integration, so you've got ICE and CIS who both work with the public. You want to ensure that there's fair and unbiased interaction. But you also have to find that balance of the person in the loop. And so I think, I can't remember now what you said, you got me down this path, but I think that in terms of what you guys are thinking about as the people who will be fighting these legal challenges, is where is that line? What does that mean to have a person? In the old days, the DOD, they used that term a lot, talking about weapons and lethal force. So was there a person that did a drone or some sort of autonomous vehicle go out and do something on its own? Or was there a person who made the call, pulled the trigger, et cetera? And so there was a person in the loop. But as you look to automate, as you look to expedite people through processes, as you look to interact with people. So one of the, I don't know if any of you followed this article the other day, but DHS announced 3 pilots. One of them is to train CIS officers in investigate or interrogate, interview, word for applicants, maybe for asylum. It can take them weeks and months to get good at that. They get good at it, and they usually have to train each other. So they have to pretend to be someone coming from a country and give responses that are combative, helpful, whatever. They have to teach each other how to recognize deceit. That's what we're trying to give them, a tool that will allow an interactive chat box to be that interaction training. Because again, these are people's lives. We need to know if they're really under persecution, and that's a very difficult thing for a person to even determine. So we're trying to automate that. That becomes a challenge.
That's a good question would be, who did you work with to create that chat box? Is it just the wonderful minds of DHS, or are there a crowdsourcing?
There will be some, it's going to be an industry, and we're going to bring in some tools, and that this comes back then to some of the earlier discussions around sort of the provenance of the data and how it's trained. There are the ethics issues and things going on in the lawsuits. New York Times challenging the right to use their information, going behind a firewall. That to me is not the concern. My concern is, did this chatbot read some hate speech on Twitter or X now, and now it believes some untrue fact about different types of people. So for us, it's it's very critical for us to know and monitor the behavior when it comes to interacting with the public, the data that's used. Another huge problem that we have is we can't hold certain data about the public. So TSA takes 70 million people on their things. You can't hold that. So how do you then train something? And then if you do have a tool, it can't continue to learn from those images, because then it could be holding those images. So it gets really complicated, really quick.
Chelsea, was there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with Rachel and Adam's comments. And I think, especially thinking about my experience in the IC, and then at Google as well, thinking about like sort of the the use cases that Adam is getting at for like when you have somebody looking at the decisions that an AI is making, and then, you know, when you can really like have efficiency gains and, you know, leverage AI to make sure that we're solving for the most, you know, difficult problems. It's a challenging one, I think, especially in these national security spaces, because there's just so much coming at everyone on a day-to-day basis. And so, you know, like, I think when I think about intelligence analysis, especially, like, there's a danger in using AI for intel analysis. You know, there's especially with generative AI, there's still, you know, like kinks that we have to work out in all of these systems. You know, black box problems come to mind where, like, you know, if you're doing analysis for a policymaker, they really need to know the sourcing behind that assessment to really like understand how you got there, and you know the all of the information that went into that. And that's something that like is really hard to pull out of an AI at this point. Like, we don't always know what in the training data informed a decision. I think hallucinations are another one. You know, when I was beta testing Google's LLM, I asked it who I was, you know, just like replicating a search that I would do on Google, you know, to see what it knew about me. And I have a really unique last name, so I am like one of two people in the United States with my name. And it came up with this crazy idea that I was like a world famous makeup artist that had my own line of cosmetics and had worked with like Jennifer Lopez and stuff, which is like funny when you're in a, you know, just these like day-to-day examples, knowing that this happens in the back of your mind. But, you know, when we're talking about some of these big like national security uses, like I certainly couldn't, as an intelligence analyst, like ask an AI, you know, like an LLM to write me a piece that goes to the president, and then not really have that human element behind like fact checking and making sure that, you know, everything you're saying isn't rooted in some craziness that the LLM makes up, you know, based on the way that it's programmed. So yeah, it's there's such an interesting balance, and so important to have it, so important to be having these conversations to really tease out these nuances. So yeah.
I just wanted to take a step back and start a question of each of you with your specific industries. What do we see as being, now that bad actors can have generative AI, what do you see as the biggest impact, or identify the biggest impact on national security?
Sorry, I feel like when I writing this paper, but also my time with Meta, and just the oversight board in general, and I focus on global issues at this point, in my career. And one thing that I did not fully understand and grasp and really root myself in until working at Meta for those 3 years was how important local context is, and how important saying like recruitment and hate speech has a very local flavor, and including the languages itself, the slurs, and understanding more of this granular approach, which as me as an American from the West who works in DC, I don't know what all of these, like, I don't know what a slur means in Armenia versus Azerbaijan. However, AI can, and AI does, and also can really understand languages. So one thing that we're seeing a lot in the terrorism recruitment space is the ability now for particularly Nazis, I will single out the white supremacy movement, shifting their propaganda using generative AI to target new audiences in places like the Philippines or like Australia. Australia has a big Nazi problem. I won't hate on my Australian coworkers too much, but how do you get your own brand of white supremacy in these places? You can use generative AI to create a lot more hate speech, a lot more local context, a lot more compelling and recruitable assets. And so it is very scary from a dis and misinformation perspective. And I think can be we don't know how much this is gonna actually create a rise in white supremacy and terrorism and lots of other places. But it's definitely something that I'm monitoring and worried about. Just to like, you know, it's
Yeah.
right after lunch, so we're all wanna wake up and talk about Nazis.
Yeah, think it's like Nazi, but,
Thank you.
I don't know that I can say one, couple of things that come to mind. You mentioned, you know, missing disinformation. I think that's a huge issue. It's not just related to, campaigns or the news, but, if you think about getting a notice to evacuate during a hurricane. Someone spoof, a legitimate notice from the public, health or, emergency risk management, in your area and create chaos by telling people to go the wrong way or to shelter in place when they should evacuate, et cetera. So knowing the bona fides of content is critical. The concept of watermarking keeps getting talked about. The thought of watermarking is sort of thinking about it backwards because everyone's gone on Google, tried to use a picture in a funny email or something, and see the Getty images watermark. That's to keep you from using that. It's really easy. Put a Getty images watermark on your own photo. So if I can generate something and then put a watermark, then it's going to look real, right? So it's sort of the opposite problem. I need to, how do I verify that the watermark is real? And so it's, you know, it's a really big challenge for emergency management and just communicating with the public. And then I think maybe the other really big one really is just the guardrail issue. There are a lot of different things that you can do with an AI, depending on what questions you're trying to ask it. You can say they're putting guardrails on it. We've seen the guardrails can be broken very easily. They can be stripped out or they can be worked around. I think that's a big part of it. What's at the heart of the New York Times lawsuit is that guardrails can be worked around that affects expel their content. So an individual can know a lot, an individual can be taught a lot, but when you have the world's knowledge in one place, all you have to do is ask it a question of how to do something, and the guardrails don't work, that's a problem. So, yeah.
Yeah, the hard part about going after these two experts is they say so many great examples, and I'm like, yes, agree. I think building off of the mis and disinformation point, I think about this a lot in the current year that we're in. You know, it's an election year in the US, and there's huge potential for mis and disinformation. I think a lot about deep fakes in this context, especially, and you know, the potential for like very believable videos to come out. And even, you know, when people understand and learn that they're not, you know, real, there's some like lingering psychological effects that are difficult to sort of take away. People will still sort of like, you know, internalize the message, even if they know that the content wasn't real. But beyond the US, you know, it's a huge election year globally. Almost half of the world's population is eligible to vote in a general level election this year. And so we see, you know, countries like India, Russia, Mexico, you know, these huge elections where, you know, generative AI could create all sorts of issues, and really like important to think about how bad actors are thinking about using these tools to manipulate elections and change voting outcomes. The other big thing that I think about in this arena, and you know, I've spent so much time in the recent past doing cybersecurity, so you'll probably hear a lot on this from me. But you know, we're really seeing bad actors create more and more sophisticated cyber attacks with you know, generative AI. So, you know, long gone are these like Nigerian prince examples where, you know, we all figured out that they were not believable, and you know, there were a million like spelling errors and stuff. We see these really sophisticated attempts to you know, like get people to click on phishing links, for example, and that'll just continue to grow and progress as generative AI becomes more sophisticated as well. So yeah, definitely big challenges ahead of us. But I think, there's a lot of like interesting opportunities that come along with it as well.
I have a follow-up for you, Chelsea, for that.
Yeah.
Specifically talking about, you mentioned speed things and, I guess I want to ask, how could bad actors be using generative AI in a way that is posing threats to, intelligence collection and, overall, threat assessments? And then what kind of things can these private sector companies be doing to fight against these threats?
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't really seen, much from bad actors who have the capability to really like hack into these systems yet. It's something that we know that they're trying to do, especially from a threat detection standpoint, but haven't seen them develop the sophistication to really like change an LLM, or manipulate what the training data looks like or anything like that would really impact a threat assessment or threat detection capabilities, which I think is good, but also we know that they're trying, and so something that we definitely need to keep an eye on. When I think about risks, from this perspective, though, some of the things I talked about previously come to mind just in terms of like reliance on these systems. I think there's been a lot of discussion, in my circles with current IC and former intelligence community people thinking about like the longevity of some of these jobs. And I point again to like the black box problems and some of the hallucinations. Like I don't think the jobs themselves will go away anytime soon, but an over reliance on AI is challenging from those perspectives. But the other thing I think about quite a bit with the intelligence community and just like the threat that comes from both from AI, but emerging technologies in general is sort of a cultural aversion to new technology. And I think we're seeing that change, with Gen Z entering the workforce and, just a lot of like push, especially from the executive branch. The IC has a new innovation unit that's really pushed it to adopt new technologies. But, when you look at these organizations, there are more than 15 agencies in the intelligence community, and there's been a lot of like cultural reticence to adopt new technology because it poses a lot of risk and especially counterintelligence risk. I'm sure many of you are too young to remember, but when like fitness watches started to be a big deal, there was an exposure of a really sensitive base in Afghanistan because people realized that they like people who were sent to the base were running around and then you had a bunch of like US Special Forces guys who had like these runs popping up in the middle of the Middle East, and so people were able to identify sensitive sites. But there's a risk to not adopting this technology as well, and especially not understanding it. And so when I think about risks from the IC perspective, really thinking about like, and I'm glad to hear that this is certainly the case that the IC is doing this, but trying to change this like culture of being a little bit wary of a lot of forms of technology and really like embracing and adopting and thinking about all the potential for both for it to help, but also for it to harm.
Jump in on that just really quickly. So a couple of things, you made some really good points on what companies can do. Another one is, if you think back to the beginning of the internet, it was built primarily for DoD purposes. It was built to move information as quickly and efficiently as possible, but never secure. No one really thought about that because they thought these would just be pipes connecting secure facilities. So security was never even thought of. So our sister agency, CISA, it has a big campaign out right now for a lot of different tools, cyber infrastructure as well, and AI is security by design. So go into building your tool, knowing instead of sort of strapping it on at the end or bolting it on, fixes, but build the system to be secure. Data poisoning is a big problem that people are concerned about. I mentioned that, and I don't think we've seen big instances of it, but we don't know what people are typing into ChatGPT. Everything you type in, it learns from. So people are just out there typing incorrect information, it's just going to grow and proliferate. So I think that there's some responsibility on the companies to provide concepts of around, or provide capabilities around privacy and security for the people that are gonna, that are gonna use these tools as they build them and not wait to find out what the government's.
I, read my paper for a full history of the internet. It is one thing that I think is really important and why we're focusing on AI today is that when DARPA and researchers across the US created the internet, it wasn't a very inclusive process. And it was primarily white men who built these functionalities, who were the early adopters of the internet. I mean, you even see, I love fan culture online, I'm a big Swiftie, but I also have, like, it's really interesting how fans have created the internet, and the Grateful Dead fans were instrumental in really bringing the internet to a larger audience. They follow them around, make recordings, share them online. It's really interesting, but AI, which is really having a rebirth and it's in another summer period, as we heard Wendy from NSF say earlier, has this moment where we can be much more inclusive, that we can, and particularly because with AI, the primary coding language is English. It is the language that we already know and speak. And so you don't have to be particularly sophisticated to red team ChatGPT or to try to put in and jailbreak or hack ChatGPT. You just need English and some creativity. I think lawyers are going to be particularly good at red teaming because we're all trained to ask questions and think analytically. And as we're coming into this new revolution of AI, how can we ensure that we're bringing diversity, we're bringing in new voices, and we're really building, a lot of people, as my friend Austin here would say, to co-create AI, to make sure that we are not having this be as top down. I think DARPA actually, I'll give them a little bit of credit, because I do think they wanted it to be bottom up. It just ended up being a little bit more top down. But AI, we really do have this moment to make it be bottom up, co-created, diverse, inclusive technology.
And the barrier to entry, we can talk about this a lot in the R&D world, nuclear technology, that's nation state wealth and resources. Cyber attacks, that's a couple $100 at your local electronics store, plug, and I need to right? The barrier to entry for AI isn't quite that cheap yet. Stacks and cards and GPUs you need to do that are a little bit more expensive. They're in the reach of the average person. It can be done. So the sort of democratization of it is there and it's here. It needs to be, we need to pay attention to it.
In terms of collaborating in order to find solutions for this, how do you think the private sector and the public sector can work together to finding solutions to these issues while also keeping in mind human rights and civil liberties?
Sure. I covered a little bit of that in my last answer, but I'll go a little deeper in. So the government used to be able to drive a lot of this because they were one of the biggest users, and so they could kind of create the supply and demand. That's changing rapidly. So the government is going to have to work a lot more with these companies. Something I haven't really talked about much yet is standards, which I think are, they're overlooked a lot when we talk about it. People think standards, and sometimes they roll their eyes, but when we talk about cell phones, we talk about Wi-Fi, that's all standards based. And the government has a big ability to drive where standards go. And so the question is, are they voluntary consensus standards, which are just that, voluntary? And then there's regulatory standards that entities like NIST, I guess, NIST and FCC and others with communications can lay these standard requirements down on people. And so, you don't want to just come in head-handed, but I think there are some conversations we had about what do we expect in terms of security being built in, what are the guardrail protections, what are the acceptable use cases, those sorts of things. but industry's moving so fast and government does not move that fast. So we'll see. You know, there's a lot of legislation on the hill right now. A lot of people working in standards, a lot of people interested, waiting to see what the government says, but it takes time.
Yeah, I think the collaboration piece is really important, and like Adam said, it definitely takes time. But I'm really I think like interested in some of the like voluntary commitments that the tech companies have been making. I think we've seen a big shift in terms of like trust in government. When I joined Google in 2018, like the US government was still sort of like this big entity that people were wary of and shied away from. I think especially as, you know, we look at like the government's interest in acquiring certain sets of technologies. And for those of you who are familiar with like Project Maven and the controversy that caused at Google, that was sort of like lingering even as I joined 5 years ago. But you know, back when I was still at Google, we worked really extensively with the White House to come up with the voluntary commitments on AI. And there's a lot of like joint collaboration, especially around these red teaming ideas. And then I think another thing that's like really interesting to me as a former government employee and then as a tech employee, just sort of the going back and forth that we're seeing now more and more in terms of talent. So people coming from government into industry to sort of like provide those perspectives, but even more so, you know, people coming from industry and going back into government, because I think for a long time that was really tricky to do. And we've seen government like make huge strides in being able to pull people in and back in and really value that like expertise and perspective. And, you know, you're seeing that kind of reflected across, you know, multiple agencies. There's huge initiatives to bring in technologists so that government understands. And so I think Rachel mentioned earlier this like multi-stakeholder approach to thinking about these issues. And I think that all is like great progress in that area.
I think it's really, and I agree, Chelsea, a lot on the need for volunteer commitments. It's interesting speaking to a group of lawyers because lawyers are most skeptical of voluntary commitments, right? You can't enforce them, there's no contracts, they're not legally binding. And so you have a lot of people, particularly from civil society, who will say, if this isn't good enough, this isn't okay, you need to give us something, you need to give us more than a voluntary commitment. And I agree, in a lot of circumstances, I do think that regulation is necessary and needed. You know, poor Adam over here can't even get a budget passed out of the Congress right now. So legislation and regulation has become very difficult to do, particularly in the tech space and particularly in the United States. And then as it has become more difficult in the US to get meaningful legislation passed and done around this, we've seen a lot of other countries, the EU primarily, but lots of other regions really charging ahead. And so thing that I think does give me hope on these voluntary commitments is that a lot of this technology and the things that we're doing are global. And so if you can't come up with a global standard, the voluntary commitments are going to at least allow companies to operate in regions where they will have some regulation and not have regulation in others. And how can we ensure that there's this gold standard that the tech companies are living up to everywhere that they go? And you mentioned human rights, and I think that my work at Meta, we have really focused on how to apply international human rights law to content moderation. I took international human rights law here at Case Western, and I think there's lots of debate on whether that is even a real thing or not. If there are true laws that govern our human rights, however, I do think that there are voluntary and agreed upon best practices or principles. And so in a world where we can't even get funding bills passed or the bare minimum of government to function, we do have to look to voluntary commitments, and we do have to think about global implications, and we do have to look to norms that have been set through things like international.
In terms of these, the private sector adopting these policies, do you find that there's been a lot of pushback, shareholders and that kind of thing? And those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think varies company by company, right? I think there are some companies that are really quick to like, yes, we'll do those voluntary commitments. And there are other companies who, you know, it's just because I like working in DC with a lot of companies, you can tell whose government affairs shops are run by their comms team and whose are run by their legal teams. And the companies who have government affairs shops run by their legal teams never sign on to voluntary commitments, right? They're like, we're not gonna sign up for this sort of liability. The comms team, government affairs shops are like, yeah, that's a great PR win for us. We'll sign up for that. Absolutely. And so it is, I think there is some, particularly on AI, where a lot of companies feel like we've been doing this for years, like IBM earlier, it's like we've been doing AI forever. We don't mind signing on to this voluntary commitment because we're already there. This isn't gonna change anything. But I worry that those legacy industry companies will set too high of standards or too that create barriers to entry that smaller innovators won't be able to meet. And honestly, they probably wouldn't sign on to voluntary commitment. So it is the great thing about America is that our businesses are very diverse and interesting, and no two are the same.
Well, I think you saw, it's been 6 months ago, that right on the heels of each other, two groups came out. There was the group, I think it was Microsoft and Google, that came out and made the commitment at the White House to come together and figure out how to make the internet or the AI safe and secure. And then you have the Adobe, the CTV. And so you saw two groups of companies taking a slightly different approach. And those big companies will figure out how to work because they will want to work with the government, won't want to expose themselves to liabilities. So they'll do what they can. But compliance is an expensive business in business. And so I'm a little less worried about sort of the big name companies, but the little companies who, not because they don't want to, but can't afford to really trace and track what's going on, that may not be able to maintain that sort of compliance with whatever standards are put in place. And they're the ones that are probably responsible.
Do you see any sort of initiative between investments with smaller businesses that might not be able to afford those?
I mean, that wouldn't be probably a DHS mission, but there might be some things going on. Other funds.
Yeah, I think, and Chelsea, feel free to answer in there. I'm trying to think of some good examples. I actually think Photo DNA, which is the software created, it's created by Microsoft, but it's used by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, is an interesting example where the big companies pay for Photo DNA. You have to spend money on it. However, if you are under a certain market cap, NCMEC will give you, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, will provide you photo DNA at no cost. And they'll also train you on how to use photo DNA, which is really important because we don't want to see child sexual exploitation material proliferating. It's terrible. There's lots of victims. It's really bad. And a small platform can have just as much of an impact on a victim as a large platform can. And so this is an area where the government, the NCMEC, has really tried to ensure that small companies have the same resources that big companies do. But I think it's because we as a society so strongly believe that it's very important to not allow children to be sexually exploited in that way. So I don't know if you have any other like examples or thoughts of.
Yeah, I mean, I do think what's interesting too, coming out of these big companies, is a lot of funding for smaller companies and trying to help them grow. I think you can look at this in two different ways, right? Like you can sort of view it as a like good faith effort to add more competition to the ecosystem, or you can look at it as like, okay, here's another company that's gonna like build up, and then we can eventually acquire it if you have a more pessimistic view of the way technology companies function. And I think especially with like the Microsoft like news this week as it applies to AI and sort of pulling some AI founders into the company. We can look at it that way. But there are millions of dollars that are spent and given to smaller companies to help them develop capabilities and sort of create a broader, more secure ecosystem. I think that's really important to every large tech company who's developing this kind of technology, because to some degree, like the safer we all are, the better. And I think that has like huge applications for AI. And so yeah, I think that's one great thing in this space, where we're really seeing like again, progress. All of this is iterative, right? I think, as Rachel mentioned, like the voluntary commitments are a good example of like good, but perhaps not good enough. But I hope that we'll get there in each of these like individual ways that we're seeing progress being made.
It's not just the small companies, it's also civil society, and making sure that we are really truly funding civil society to a degree that they can meaningfully engage with the process and the discussion. I get that there's a lot of criticism around companies or governments funding civil society, but it is really important that their work is so crucial, and we have to be paying people to do this work, because if you don't pay civil society to do this work, if somebody's not contributing to it, then you end up in like situations like Saudi Arabia doesn't have a real civil society. There's nobody pushing back on privacy and security and surveillance, things like that. And so the other group that I really want to make sure that we're bringing into these discussions and funding and giving access to it is our civil society.
I know we only have 5 more minutes, and I know this question that I'm gonna ask. But, and we'll be sorry. We spoke a little bit about women protection and protection, and then also this abstract idea, what is uncontrolled violations as well, when it comes to gathering intelligence. What do you think is the line here when it comes to the government department using generative AI in terms of national security?
No, it's all right. It is. I'll try to touch it. I'll try to hit it really quickly. So the ethics side, again, I think ethics is as well. Attorneys know this is an extremely gray definition, ethics of whatever they are, to whoever you ask. I think when you talk about sort of legal and responsible, we're looking at Gen AI tools very carefully now. The 3 pilots that came out that were announced the other day. One is to just recap the tools. Don't know. One is to generate emergency response plans for small communities. So to be eligible for certain government programs, you have to have a response plan. They can be thousands of pages. New York City has a big budget. They can write one of these. Small cities, small towns don't always have the ability. So we're trying to produce something like that. Again, that's a sort of low consequence. People will have to read it, but that's very unlikely to create issues. If I look at the thing training interviewers for asylum cases, that one starts to have consequence, but because it's a training tool and they can learn from it and other people will be watching, there's there are some safeguards and guardrails there. It's when you start to get into using Gen AI to generate leads for cases that I think we have to be very careful, and we are being very careful watching it. Again, we keep that sort of concept of person in the loop. People will continue to have to verify as Gen AI has become the talk of the day. It's the buzzword of this year. What will the buzzword of next year be? So no matter what happens as we move from LLMs, LMMs, whatever's next, I think it's maybe not real time, but it is going to be consistent monitoring and understanding of what your tools are doing, to just make sure we're always in the lines of the laws. I don't know that there's ever going to be a silver bullet. I think we'll always have to watch. Years ago, the Hill, when AI was sort of in its infancy, and people were really starting to talk about the prospect of becoming a real tool used in the department. We were asked about could my agency within DHS be asked or used as a validator for a tool to make sure that it's safe to use? And I had to explain to them, like a hammer, it's a tool, but a hammer can be used to destroy things as well as build things. You can't talk about the tool being safe, it's the use and the way it's trained and the data and the results. So, you know, there's a lot more to it than just, you know, is this a safe technology? Is the data right, but are we using it properly? So it will be a constant churn of making sure we're doing the right things.
Yeah, I think it's similar to, and the way we ended the copyright panel is like, the Fourth Amendment issues, I think, are gonna get sorted out in litigation at some point in time. So maybe you all could like bring litigation and help sort out Fourth Amendment issues. Not against Adam, though.
Yeah, please.
He would have.
And I see the 1 minute sign, but just, I mean, the Fourth Amendment, police officers walking by a yard, 7-foot fence, whatever's happening on the other side, it's happening on the other side. He only has reason to cross it, if he has reason to cross it. I have an AI tool, I stumble on some data. What was my, like, on the word, what was my probable cause to stumble into that data? And so that's where, that's where we'll all start to figure this out.
I think Adam covered it. Most of my background is human intelligence collection, and so I think we're still, you know, the jury's still out on like how we're gonna see generative AI really play a role in that. But appreciative of Adam's remarks because I learned something new just now too.
I want to open up just really quickly if there's any questions.
No, standing between you and your freedom, so no questions is fine. Yeah, I think did you, Gianna, do you want to say anything before we wrap up? Thank you. Thank you. Oh, this is the end.
Oh, okay, right now you are.
Yeah, we're done.
Okay, well, hold on, let me take a picture of you first. Before I'm awkwardly standing up here. No. Okay, I'll say something really quick. First of all, thanks everyone so much for coming. Like, this was a great event. We've heard a lot about today, in my article focuses on, my paper focuses on. So just to kind of highlight those really quickly, if you're interested more in any of the topics that you've heard, my paper covers, Hunter's article, Helen's article, Professor Murray's article, and Rachel's article are all live on Zolti's website. And by early summer, Eudora's article, Kyle and Mark's article, and Ian's article will be live as well. So if you're interested in any of those, I really encourage you to check them out. I think at one point Rachel said hers, like, give it a read. It's not a quick read, like she claimed it, but like it was a really great paper. So definitely encourage you all to check it out.
You're passing the class, okay, you don't.
I'm not being just saying that. I couldn't have to read it like 5 times. So, thank you everyone for coming. Have a great rest of your afternoon. If you want more food, please take food with you. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for joining.
Oh God, yeah, we have to shout out to Jenna. Yeah, Jenna, all of CAI is really like, it took an